This episode was supposed to be about AWP, but that can wait. I have more pressing matters to discuss. I want to talk about the Steubenville rape case. As I'm sure you know, two 16-year-old football players raped a 16-year-old girl who was passed out drunk. They took pictures of it and spread them around the internet. Now, the verdict of their trial came in a few days ago, and they were found guilty. Thank God they were found guilty. I was really afraid for a while that they would not be found guilty, but at least they were. But what pissed off the internet is how news channels reacted to the verdict. News sources were mourning for these two teenagers whose lives were ruined because of the guilty verdict. News stations said things like, "These poor boys, how they started to cry when the verdict was read, and they had such promising futures, up-and-coming football players, wah, 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 boo-hoo-hoo." And we're talking about reputable news sources here. We're not talking Fox News. Fox, la 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 la, I can't hear you, by the way, President Obama is a space Nazi news. We're talking CNN. Shame on you, CNN. I had hoped for better from you. I'm disappointed in you, CNN. Meanwhile, not one of these news sources said anything about the 16-year-old girl that the boys raped and documented, and anyone who did say anything chided her for being drunk and passing out at a party. She should have known better. She should have been aware of her surroundings. She deserved what she got. Those boys did what anyone would do. I wish I were making this up. She deserved what she got. Those boys did what anyone would do. Guys, seriously, these are legitimate beliefs of members of our citizenship. Alright, so let me deconstruct this whole situation for you guys. The reason that this blame the victim phenomenon exists is because of what psychologists refer to as the just world hypothesis. And this states that as humans, we want the world to make sense. We want good things to happen to good people, and we want bad things to happen to bad people. So if somebody makes $1 billion, we say it's because they're a smart businessman, and they worked hard, and they devoted their lives to their company. Conversely, if somebody is living on the street without $1 to their name, we say it's because he's an alcoholic drug user, never worked a day in his life, is just mooching off the government. We want the world to make sense, but honestly, it doesn't. Good things happen to bad people all the time, and bad things happen to good people, honestly, more often than not. So this, in tandem with the patriarchal nature of our society, is what causes people to blame a girl for being raped. Now, logically, that doesn't make any sense. You don't blame a person for being blind. You don't blame a person for being mugged on the street. You don't blame a person for being a victim of a random shooting. You don't blame a person for being raped. You don't blame someone for something over which they have no control. Period. That's it. End of discussion. Oh, but she should have known better. She should have been aware of her surroundings. Okay, so that brings me to number 2. I'm not excusing the fact that she was underage and drunk. I recognize the illegality of that, and I'm not excusing it. But that's no excuse for the boys either. She was drunk. How could she be aware of her surroundings? She was passed out drunk. But more importantly, you're yelling at her for not being aware of her surroundings when she was passed out drunk? But nobody's yelling at the sober, academically and athletically advanced boys who took advantage of her and raped her. Why is it her job to make sure she isn't raped? Isn't it instead the job of every man not to rape? Those boys just did what any other boy would do. Yeah, I wish I could play this off as a joke, but that's an actual argument that people have had about this. So, number 3, bullshit. The natural state of a human male is not rapist. The natural state of a human female is not sexual object. These boys did not do what any other man would do. They did exactly what a sex offender would do. They are not the norm. Their actions are not typical. Their actions are not acceptable. I literally cannot stress this enough. Those boys were systematically taught to look at women as objects. Those boys were praised and rewarded when they exerted their sexuality over others, even when it was unwanted and unwarranted. Those boys learned through careful observation and modeling and conditioning that they will not be held accountable for their actions, that instead their victims will be held accountable for their actions, that it will be her fault that she wasn't aware of her surroundings, and that they just did what any other man would do. They will be excused, and she will be blamed. And now that they are finally being held accountable for their actions, now that the law calls them guilty, poor babies, they had their whole lives ahead of them, such promising futures. Yeah, they did have their whole lives ahead of them. And yeah, I bet they did have promising futures, but you know what? Tough titties, boys. That's what happens when you rape someone. That's what happens when you document that rape and release it onto the internet. No one should grieve for these boys. Grieve for the 16-year-old girl who drank too much and passed out. Grieve for the 16-year-old girl who thought she was in a safe environment. Grieve for the 16-year-old girl who was raped by 2 of her classmates and had pictures of it spread around the internet. Grieve for the 16-year-old victim of rape who was completely ignored by the press during the trial. Oh, and that same 16-year-old girl, she was referred to as the alleged rape victim by the self-same media who ignored her. And another thing, these boys were tried as minors. 16-year-old boys who raped a girl and leaked photos of it were tried as minors. Because they didn't know what they were doing was wrong. I can't anymore. I just can't. I can't do it. It's shit like this that reminds me how ingrained sexism is in our culture. Every day, I try my best to hope that people will come around and see the error of their ways, and I try to surround myself with feminists and empathetic progressive thinkers, but then shit like this happens, and I remember how messed up this country can be. Alright, that's all for me. I need to lie down. I can feel my blood pressure rising. I'll talk to you later, Jackie.